So shall we start?
Yes.
Anybody have any questions or concerns about the last set of classes and the setup of Matthew's Gospel and those kinds of things? Or is that all that gone? So, well, because the reason I ask is because something that's going to show up tonight. You know, we talked about Matthew's Gospel having, we got a whole group coming in. So let them all come in. We got about 4.
There's an empty chair. Clothes we have to wear. There's a lot of work.
You're on the cleanup committee. Because you're late, you're on the cleanup committee.
Wonderful. Wherever you can hear it from. The sisters had a little longer cocktail hour tonight.
How did you know?
Okay, so Sister Juliana's passing around a sign-up list. Now we're on the new set of classes for the next 15 hours of growing in your faith, following year, or more. I was amazed at how many people did so many things, but so as I mentioned in trying to set up Matthew's Gospel, I mentioned that there are 2 or possibly 3 basic sources that are being pulled from. Obviously, Mark's Gospel has a lot of what's in Matthew's Gospel, and for those who think that Mark's Gospel was the first written, then obviously Matthew and Luke must have pulled much of their material from Mark. As I mentioned, there's good reason to question that. There's a few scholars who question that, but the general opinion is that Mark was written first. But then also, Matthew and Luke have a number of parallel passages that Mark does not include in his gospel. So there must be some other source that they're both using that they must have pulled this. So if they pulled material from Mark, then there must be something else that they pulled material from in order to get that material out. Among those things, we'll have one of those right here in the Beatitudes. And the sermon in Matthew's Gospel, it's called the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke's Gospel, it's called the Sermon on the Plain. And yes?
Why is that? Why is one called on the mountain and one on the plain?
If it's the same sermon, and if it was delivered in the same place, what happens is there's a natural amphitheater on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so if you're standing in the valley near the shore, the mountain rises up around you like this. So it creates this amphitheater effect. So if you're standing here, then you can talk to the people, and they will all be able to hear you like in a theater. Okay? So it's your point of view. So if you're the person sitting on the mountain and listening to Jesus, then it's the Sermon on the Mount. But if you're the person on the plain, if you're Jesus on the plain talking to other people, then it's the Sermon on the Plain. Okay? That's presuming that this is the same sermon. And I'm going to question that. I mean, most scholars would say that it's the variations on the same sermon because they both have the Beatitudes and they both follow a similar format, but they diverge. I'm going to question that basically on the understanding. How many of you have ever gone to 2 of my masses on the same Sunday? And is the homily different? It's essentially the same, but there are sometimes significant differences. Sometimes it's an entirely different homily. But usually it's the same homily, but there are sometimes significant differences between one to the other. And part of that is the crowd. Part of that is after I'm done preaching once, I grow in understanding of what I said. And so I kind of redevelop it and shuffle it again new. Because I don't write the script out, so because I'm not following the script, the homily becomes a living thing. So if Jesus is a preacher and is going from place to place, then when we look at the differences in the Beatitudes, because in the Beatitudes there are significant differences as we go through them, but if we look at the differences in the Beatitudes between Matthew and Luke, it could be that these are two variations on the same sermon. That it may not have been the same sermon given at the same time, but the same sermon given in two places or to two crowds. So they, or two different times. So it could be the same sermon, but kind of reshuffled along the line. I'm not sure which one would come first or second, but that would be a consideration that most of the scholars don't come up with. But most of the scholars are not practicing preachers; they're scholars, and so they're sitting there studying the original text, and they're looking at the text and saying, "Here's where this connects with that, and here's the difference." And so they're looking at the Greek text, and they're not looking at it from the point of view that maybe they are actually recording two different sermons. There is a book out. Oh, actually, it's out of print now. My brother had a copy of it from years ago, and he scanned it. He sent it to me, but I didn't bring it with me at all. But he scanned it into a PDF file. But it basically, what this book does is it takes everything in the gospel and puts it together. So all four gospels, it puts them together, but it doesn't merge anything. So it basically gives you a kind of a new gospel text, trying to keep everything that's in the gospels as they are in something similar where they're supposed to be. It's contrived, obviously, but the person who did that was trying to say, we don't blend the gospel to find, kind of make our own gospel or just kind of like push things together. We should let everything that's being said by the Lord stand. In the Catholic Church, we basically do that by reading one gospel a year. And so by focusing only in on Matthew or focusing in on only in Mark or Luke, it enables us to look at that gospel as it stands on its own. This one was to bring all the gospels together and try and keep them all standing, and all the words that they had standing on their own, but all at the same time. And if you're interested in that, I can pass that PDF file along to you. But as I said, it's a contrived thing to do. It's much more realistic to take the Gospels one at a time as they are, because that's how they were conveyed by the apostles. That's how they were conveyed by the early Christians to us. They did not have a problem that there was a Matthew-Matthean Gospel and a Lucan Gospel. They allowed each of them to live and kind of grow to become part of the canon. There were a couple of other Gospels, as I mentioned also. There's like the Gospel of Thomas you'll hear about, or there's a Gospel of Mary Magdalene. All of these are known as apocryphal Gospels because they did not make it into the Bible. There are things in them that the church, that the apostles did not see as truthful, or that the early church bishops did not see as part of the gospel message. And so they dismissed them in their entirety. Not that everything about them was wrong, but there was enough of it that was wrong that they were not going to allow that in. Remember, we talked about it being gospel truth. So everything in the gospel has to ring true to our Christian beliefs. And that's why these four, even though they're different, all ring true to what we believe. Does that make sense? So we're going to start because chapter 5 in Matthew's Gospel, this is the first teaching of Jesus. And also, as I mentioned, Matthew's Gospel is set up as a series of teachings and movements. So Jesus teaches and then he moves. And usually when he's moving, he's encountering people. And then there's a place where he stops and he teaches. And then he goes on and more action happens. So the teaching doesn't happen, he's not on the way usually and then he's talking to people while they're walking. There's usually a place where he stops, he teaches people, and then after he's done teaching, it's usually significant, at least one whole chapter. Then he moves and something else happens. So this is the first of the teaching moments in Jesus' Jesus' ministry here is the Sermon on the Mount. And this one is the longest in Matthew's Gospel. It's 3 chapters. It's 5, 6, and 7. And so many people know the Beatitudes. They know it's chapter 5. They know a lot of other teachings about Jesus. And unfortunately, last Sunday, because it was February 2nd, was the presentation of the Lord, which is a wonderful feast and a wonderful gospel to read. But because of the way it fell on a Sunday, we missed the Beatitudes. So we didn't get to hear the Beatitudes because that's the fourth Sunday gospel. And so the regular fourth Sunday gospel we missed because it was superseded by the presentation of the Lord. And so when we go to the fifth Sunday, we're going to get the teaching on salt and light. You have the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But the first 12 verses, they're gone. So my only suggestion is go back and read them, or if you've read them already, to prepare for tonight. That way you have it. You're better prepared for the next gospel that comes up this Sunday. It was a shame, and if it weren't for the cardinal coming this weekend to say the mass, I would have said, well, let's read them anyway. But I'm not preaching at the masses either. We got the deacons preaching. It's the second weekend, so I really couldn't, put my hand into all of that. So the Beatitudes, and they begin. Jesus gathers his disciples, and one of the commentators mentions that the way it's set up, Jesus isn't really talking to the crowds. This isn't necessarily to the crowds. It is to the disciples. That's how he sets it up. So Jesus stops on this mount. He gathers his disciples around him. Now, we're not talking about the 12 apostles. We're talking about the disciples. The disciples are all those who follow Jesus. So there's a number of people who follow him. Remember, of the people who followed him, he chose 12 to be what he called apostles. To have that special place. But there are many disciples. So this is specifically to the disciples. So it helps change the understanding. And we'll just go ahead and go through and read the first Beatitudes, the first 12 verses there. So when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. So he saw the crowds, but he was talking to the disciples. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you, if they insult you, persecute you, and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me." The original translation said utter every kind of slander, so you know it's false, because of me. "Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. Thus they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So again, by closing it, referring to the prophets, it's obvious he's only talking to the disciples, so those who are following. So we have this relationship. So the first thing we find is that every one of them begins with that phrase, "blessed." The Anchor Bible prefers to translate that as fortunate. Other translations will hold that as happy. The reason people get away from the blessed is because it has liturgical connotations. I talked about a blessing at Mass, or a sacramental blessing. And so when people hear the word blessed or blessed, they might think of this sacramental connotation. But happy isn't quite enough, because this happiness is something that comes from God. It comes from right relationship or right action. And therefore it's not simply happiness. And it's not simply fortune. There's that sense that there is the hand of God in this. There is not necessarily a reward, but there is something right in doing this. So it is a blessed life. But again, we can't push it too much to the spiritual. Otherwise, we miss the point that it's really to call us to something. So as we look at the attitudes, first thing that we see is that they're different than the world's values. Okay? The world doesn't usually look at the poor or the poor in spirit as someone who's blessed or someone who's fortunate or someone who's going to receive a reward. The world doesn't see those who are sorrowful as something to go after. So there's a reversal going on here of what the world is thinking. And each of these beatitudes, each of these traits that are being brought forward, they are being brought forward with the promise of reward. But Jesus is saying, now they are blessed. So that the blessing comes in the morning. The blessing comes through the sorrow. The blessing comes through the struggle to make peace or the hunger and thirst for righteousness. The blessing comes through those things. So even though there's struggle, even though there's pain, that's where the blessing comes from. And the reward comes later. In Luke's Gospel, and I want to bring this up because this is very important. So, because as I said, there's the Sermon on Mount, Sermon on the Plain, and the difference is in Luke's Gospel, instead of having 8 blessings, he has 4 and 4. He has 4 blessings and 4 curses or woes. So he says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for the kingdom is yours. Blessed are you who are now hungry, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who are now weeping, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and insult you and denounce your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice and leap for joy on that day, behold, the reward will be great in heaven. For their ancestors treated the prophets in the same way. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are filled now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will grieve and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for their ancestors treated the false prophets in this way." So Luke balances. He does 4 blessings and 4 curses or 4 woes, which is why I mentioned at the beginning is that this could very easily be a development on the sermon. It could easily be a second sermon and not the same sermon heard by 2 different people and reporting it incorrectly. Okay, because that's the first thing we think of. It's the same thing. Then somebody's got it wrong. Did Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem before Jesus was born and then moved to Nazareth, or they lived in Nazareth and then went down for the census and then came back to Nazareth? The 2 Gospels have 2 different points of view. Who's right? So that's the first thing we think of. Who's right on this? And that's the same thing. So we have this sermon, the same sermon on the Plain on the Mount. But there's differences. As I was looking at it, I'm thinking it could very well be a development of the sermon at another time, different place, whatever. But I'm not sure which one would be earlier or later, because even though the Gospels are written earlier or later, that doesn't mean that the sermon, as they reported, was given at that time or another. So Luke could be the Gospel that was written later, but what he's reported is a sermon that happened earlier, and then Jesus changed it. Or maybe Jesus decided that there's just too many blessings out there, and we need to kind of, spank a few people and give you a few woes. So sometimes the everybody's good thing doesn't work, and so you have to cut that down a little bit. It could be either one of those. But most Christians, and the other person who has a wonderful reflection on this is Pope Benedict. In his book on Jesus of Nazareth, as he goes through the Beatitudes, it's a really wonderful reflection at that point in the book. But most people see these Beatitudes, they see them similar to the 10 Commandments. And so what happens is we use these Beatitudes not as Jesus is giving them, to say, here's a situation, I'm turning the world around, but we use them as commandments and say, this is what I'm supposed to do. what I'm supposed to do. Now, some scholars they have two different points of view when they talk about these beatitudes as commandments. One is they see Jesus as giving us the perfection ideal. This is what we are supposed to do. This is how you are to live your life. This is a commandment. Others say that this, and this was a Lutheran scholar, and we see this actually in Lutheran theology and basic Lutheran philosophy, that this is an ideal that we cannot possibly reach. That this idea of being poor in spirit is to its extreme is impossible. So what Jesus is saying, here's what you're supposed to be, and this is perfection. But of course we know we can't do that, which makes us depend more upon God. Which was the whole point of Luther's theology was that because we're incapable of earning salvation, of earning this grace, we must depend more fully upon that grace of God. So his sense was to encourage people to truly see God's hand in their lives. You have to recognize your inability to do that good which we're being called to do. But both of those would come from that idea that this is a commandment. This is what we're supposed to do. There's a third one. Let me go back to that. There's a third view of this, which is that see this as that Jesus is proposing an ethic that is in between. So in a sense, it's giving us a last chance before the end of the world. So here's one more time of what God is calling us, and it's this interim ethic, they call it, that enables us to say, okay, here's what we should be doing, here's what we should be like, and if we can do this, then we will be in the right place when the world ends. So that was the third point of view on this. I personally think, first and foremost, the standard translation is that we call these blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are those who mourn. First and foremost, we should take this and recognize where the blessings in life are. And we should take them exactly as Jesus is saying. This is one of those times that we need to be a little bit more literal. Because again, Jesus is turning the world upside down, and too few people see themselves as blessed when they are in pain, or when they are suffering, when something's going wrong, or when they don't have everything they think they're supposed to have. And so, and this is something that happens regularly. This is part and parcel of a Calvinistic theology. But it has, it creeps itself into the Catholic mindset at times. It certainly is found in the Jewish mindset. It's preached very much so by the evangelicals and the Pentecostals who follow that Calvinist theology, which is that if you're a good person, God blesses you. If you're a bad person, God curses you. Therefore, what you should be looking for, God's blessings, and you're supposed to do those things, and God blesses you in this world. It's the Reverend Ike driving the Rolls Royce and saying, I have this because I do what God wants me to do, and that's why I have a gold Rolls Royce. It's the Freddie K. Price, who was a preacher back in the 80s, a black Pentecostal preacher in the 80s, who would sit there. I remember the one sermon I saw on TV, and he said, you know why I've got this $600 suit? I'm wearing a $600 suit. You know why I'm wearing a $600 suit? Because a pimp on the street can wear a $600 suit. A child of God can wear a $600 suit. So again, there was that sense of the blessings of this world are for those who do well, who do what they're supposed to do. And there are many preachers out there, many of the TV preachers talk about having a positive attitude, so we're blessed. And what does Jesus want to do? He wants to bless us. And of course, they're always talking about blessings in this world, as well as blessings in heaven. But they're always talking about blessings in this world. that also doesn't ring true, does it, to the Beatitudes? It's the blessings that Jesus specifically wants to highlight are the ones that we don't recognize. And of course, when I talk about stewardship, one of the things that people, the first thing people think when I talk about stewardship and I think, okay, well, if I have to give more money, the first thing they come with is, but I don't have that blessing. I don't have that blessing. I don't have this. I don't have that. They start thinking of what they don't have instead of thinking about what they do have. And that's exactly what Jesus is, kind of pushing toward. This is what you have. So you're poor in spirit. That doesn't mean you're not blessed. So you're mourning. It doesn't mean you're not blessed. So these blessings are available to us, and particularly to those that the world has forgotten. And that's significant to the Christian mindset, because that has empowered the Christian mindset. All aspects of the Christian mindset, not just Catholics, but all the entire spectrum of Christianity has been empowered by that sense of reaching out to the unfortunate, to those who are less fortunate than we are. That has been the hallmark of Christianity. It's found in other religions as well, but that's one of the things that we really strive to do. Particularly, we demand it of our churches. So that maybe not as individuals, we may not be as good at that, but we certainly would not want to see our churches ignoring the poor, the hungry, the homeless. So those are things that we specifically want to strive for. Yes.
Quite a few times people ask me to bless them, like I went about 3 weeks ago to get the car wash, and a new group that owns the place, a mother, father, and a nephew, and then they said, "Sister, please, would you give us a blessing?" So we all gathered and I asked for a blessing. And then on Sunday, after I checked the votes in the church, I was on my way back to the convent, and I saw a man walking down the morning. I was over going to church, and he didn't answer me. He said, "Sister, please bless me." So I went to go to the Spanish, and he had like tears in his eyes.
Because he spoke Polish? I'm sorry.
And then I didn't want him to, I was wondering if he was going into the church or he seemed moved with that. So when I got to the curb, I turned around to see that he was sitting on the bench, just speaking. So when people ask, they ask me to bless them, what are they really asking for when they want me to say that prayer? That makes any sense.
I don't know. But they see in you a certain holiness, and they want that to share with them.
See, when I really have it, I feel
Right.
it says I'm for you, I'm for everybody, I'm for you.
Again, they may not understand the liturgical blessing, because obviously sisters and brothers can't give a liturgical blessing, but everybody can give their blessing to somebody else. Everybody can offer a prayer or blessing for someone else. So grandmothers always bless their grandchildren. Parents bless their children. It's part and parcel of life. So I don't know. I don't know them, so I don't know exactly what they're looking for. If they're thinking there's a liturgical blessing, or simply it's more likely they see in you a holiness that they want to share of, and so that's what they're seeking. And of course, that's exactly what Jesus is trying to promote, is that sense of seeing the holiness in people that others would not see as blessed. Because as I mentioned, it's not just Calvinist or Pentecostal theology, but also all the way back to the Jewish theology, that Jewish mentality, and it does creep up in Catholic theology at times. That if we are materially blessed, then it must be because we're doing something right. And if we're not materially blessed, then it must be we're doing something wrong. So I'm not sure what I did today, but many things went wrong. So I must have done something wrong to have all those things go wrong. That's that kind of mindset that we get into. But that's not really what happens. And that's one of the things that Jesus, first thing he does in trying to teach us, is to get us beyond that.
An awful lot of people are ignoring the book of Job, is what I noticed.
People are ignoring a lot of
He
things.
said there's something, there's something that you are not, and that's why we did.
Well, they're ignoring the lessons of Job. Many of them know Job, but they always think they don't realize how it ends or how it goes through. Okay, any questions about where we're at with that? I knew that this, in order to get through the Sermon on the Mount, we're probably not going to be able to do all sets of the teachings of Jesus in one section. Well, that's further down. But, and actually, I want to get to that in terms of what some of these mean. Okay. So let's go to that. And for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And as we look at that, the best sense here is the kingdom will consist of such as these. So rather than saying the kingdom of heaven is theirs as a reward, again, because as we hear that, we're thinking, okay, here's the reward, here's the blessing, here's the reward. But what this commentator, let me get this. So this is the Anchor Bible series. But so what Albright and Mann are saying, suggesting, bless you, are that that it's not in the sense of the reward, but again, going back to the sense of turning the world upside down and looking at the world in a new way. So when you see those who are poor in spirit, these are the kind of people who are part of heaven, who are part of the kingdom of God. These are the people, the kingdom of heaven consists of these kinds of people. So when you see that, because again, remember that the kingdom of heaven is given to two groups. It's given at the beginning and the end. So and they will see God, and then also those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven consists of all these people: those who are poor in spirit, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, those who are pure of heart. These are the people who are part of the kingdom of heaven. So that's what he's gathering. So again, we look at this as this is a commandment. Here's my, so if I do what I'm supposed to do, here's my reward. If I remain humble, poor in spirit, then I'll get into heaven. Well, that part is true, but that's not really the teaching. Okay? So to be humble before God is one of the ways we get into heaven. However, that's not what the teaching is about. The teaching is about, looking at the world as it is, and not as we think it, not as the world wants it to be, but rather as the Lord wants it to be. And these are the people who belong to God, the ones who depend upon Him, the ones who have the right mindset for Him, the ones who are pure of heart, the ones who are simple, the ones who are making peace. These are all part of that kingdom of heaven. When it says the blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Again, the Aramaic there really the real phrase would be they're the ones who are close. And they use the phrase because it's also used in another time. They talk about the sons of the prophets. So those who, and by that they mean those who follow the prophetic voices. So not necessarily their natural heirs, but rather those who follow the prophetic voices. They're called sons of the prophets or the children of the prophets. So when they translated it as the same way because it's the same phrase in Aramaic, and they talked about this as those who are close to God. These are peacemakers are those who follow the Lord. So, and the best way of saying that is they're around Him because they're the children of God. So it's a good image to use. It's a symbolic translation and not a literal translation. And sometimes we get caught in that because if you do know both languages, sometimes you'll find some of the words shifting between one translation between English and Spanish, or one translation of the Bible to another, whether it's Polish to English, or German to Polish, whatever. And part of that is there are some places where images are being used as part of the translation. So they choose the best image. So they're not going to choose the image that is wrong for us. And I'll get to that specifically as I get to the next passage on this. So as we talk about the poor in spirit, humble in spirit, and again, we normally think about it in terms of poverty, but really, as it says, in terms of the Qumran material, which is, I mentioned that the community at Qumran, which they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, in terms of the Qumran community, those living in uprightness or perfection, the phrase is more accurately translated. So humble in spirit, not poor in spirit per se. And two words in Hebrew, which provide us with the background for this, are anawim and aniyim. They both mean afflicted. Not just poor, not poverty poor, but afflicted and humble. So that's the kind of poor we're talking about, those who are afflicted in spirit, not those who have nothing in their wallet. Any questions on the Beatitude? Do you want me to go through each of these, or I don't think I need to go through all of these. I want to at least get to the salt and light thing, because that'll set us up for the gospel on Sunday. So as he finishes off, again, he brings back that idea of the prophet. So, thus they persecuted the prophets before you. And again, the translation here, they changed the translation. The old one was, blessed are they who persecute you and blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of slander against you. That should be the translation. Because slander in English is always false. That's what makes it slander, and it's always evil. If it's not false and evil, it's not slander. So what they did is they replaced one word with three. So they tell you, okay, so we utter every kind of evil against you falsely. That's just basically those who slander you. And I think what happened is probably they got caught by lawyers or something like that, thinking, okay, well, there's a new legalistic definition or something that people don't understand. Or people just use slander as insult now. They don't realize that slander is not an insult. It's always a false accusation or false insult. And it's always evil. So you can't slander somebody by saying they're a great guy. That person is just wonderful. That may be false, but it's not slander because it's not evil. Okay. As he goes on, then he continues on, and what I want to set up here is just very quickly to look at 5, 6, and 7 as the chapters in this. Because normally as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, you're bringing them all up as one. Chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, normally we just see them all as one large sermon. And there's a possibility that these are phrases that have been grouped together. Again, the gospel writer takes his knowledge of the Lord, takes his knowledge of the community, takes his knowledge of what happens, and then brings us the gospel message. And so it's not necessarily a historical rendering of what Jesus did from one moment to another, but rather a presentation of who Jesus is. Because the point of the gospel is to give us good news. It's not to be a biography. It's to give us the good news of Christ himself. But so many people either look at this as individual teaching. And sometimes we slide through 5, 6, and 7, just like we slide through those parts of Genesis where they do all the begats. And you get tired of reading one begat to another begat. And what happens here in after the Beatitudes, which are beautiful, then we start getting into these very specific teachings, one after another, after another, after another. And so because it's just one after another, we tend to slide around them. And we don't look at the beauty of each one, nor do we see how they fit together. So what I'm going to suggest to you is if we look at them together, we have 5. And 5 is built on 5 is built on us. Who are we? before God. So, if you just take the teachings that are in 5, who are we before God? So, looking at those, you have the Beatitudes, which of course talk about who we are before God in terms of whether or not we're blessed, whether or not we see the world in an entirely new way. But then it talks about you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Then it talks about a teaching on law. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish but to fulfill them. So it's giving this sense of God's law, and where do we come in with this this law of God? And then it goes on. It talks about anger. You have heard that was said to your ancestors, "You shall not kill. Whoever kills will be liable to judgment. I say to you, whoever grows angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." So now it's now taking some of the 10 Commandments and again he begins with the same commandment when the rich young man comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to enter heaven?" Because you ought to be perfect. And Jesus says, "You know the commandments." And he begins by saying, "You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not lie." He doesn't begin with, "I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me." He begins with number 5, and he ends the list with number 4, "Honor your father and mother." Which of course, again, is one of the most basic commandments, but it should be so basic that it doesn't need to be said till the end of the list. So, as he's doing this teaching, as he's doing the Sermon on the Mount, again, as he starts to go through commandments, he goes right to, number 5, "You shall not kill you." That's what was said to your ancestors. But I'm going to give you more than that. I gave you a better picture of the world, of who's blessed in the world. Now I'm going to give you a better picture of what the commandments mean. And so let's look at the commandment on killing. But again, then he goes from killing to adultery. 5 or 6. Then he goes to teaching about divorce, which either is a thing to 6 again because of adultery, which is one of the reasons why there's divorce, but also it can go back to 9 and 10 when you talk about coveting your neighbor's wife, coveting your neighbor's goods. So as we go through these, he's going through the commandments now, and then he's talking about the teaching on oaths. This goes all the way back to commandment number 1. I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. So you cannot take oaths before anything because God is the only one who has that power. And then it comes about teaching about retaliation. And then finally, chapter 5 concludes with the love of enemies. So you have heard that we said you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, you shall love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father, for he makes the sun to rise on the bad and the good. He causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love only those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not tax collectors do the same. And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that? Do not pagans do the same? And then again, the translations here are various over different Bibles and over different time frames. So the New American says, "So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect." The old translation is, "You must be perfected as your heavenly Father is perfect." So all of 5 is really looking at us. Looking at those commandments, and again, those are the commandments that deal with us in the world, don't they? Particularly with our behavior. So our behavior, whether or not we grow angry, whether or not we keep ourselves pure in terms of honoring marriage relationships, honoring promises, whether or not we covet others, whether or not we simply dismiss or divorce, whether or not we take oaths falsely or we retaliate. Those are all about who we are and what are we supposed to do. You go to chapter 6, and you have a movement here. We're still in the Sermon on the Mount, but you have a movement here. And now these teachings, and as you go through them, they're the teaching about almsgiving, they're the teaching about prayer, it's the Lord's Prayer is in here, then the teaching about fasting, and then it talks about treasures in heaven, and it talks about the light of the body, and it talks about God and money, and it talks about dependence on God. This is now this is about what we're supposed to do in our relationship with God. How do we treat God? So how do we treat God? So now there's each of these chapters, they're all part of the same sermon, but they are grouped. The teachings are grouped. They're not just one thing after another, kind of a scatter shot. Okay, here's a little bit something about divorce. Here's a little bit something about anger. They're being grouped, and they're being grouped very specifically. The third one, chapter 7. We could. That's the problem when you use that telephone. So anyway, you know that it's with God. I'm not going to start trying to correct you today. Just listen. Into chapter 7, and now we have another movement going on in terms of what's being taught to us. So here are the topics that are being taught in the various things. Now the topics come when chapter 7, judging others, throwing your pearls before swine. The answer to prayer, asking will be given to you, seeking you'll find, knock, and the door will be open for you. Everyone who seeks, everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds. And then it goes on the golden rule. Do to others what you would have them do to you. The narrow gate, try to enter through the narrow gate. The gate that leads, the gate is wide that leads to destruction. And how many choose to enter through it. How narrow the gate, strictly the road that leads to life. And how few will find it. False prophets, and then being a true disciple. And then the two foundations. Everyone who listens to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came. This is the end of the teaching, obviously. The winds blew and buffeted the house, but it did not collapse. It had been soundly set on rock. So chapter 7, before you get to that end, that is your relationship with others. So now this is how we relate to others. Somehow this week. 7 became 2. Try that. It's still 2. I guess I don't know how to make 7. Chapter 7, others. The pen knows me better than I do. So the teachings that are in here are really mostly about how we relate to others. And again, as I said, it's how we judge others, or whether or not how we look upon them in terms of the pearls before swine, the answer to our prayers, what are we looking for, how we treat them, treat others as we have them treat you, the narrow gate, recognizing false prophets, being a true disciple of the Lord. So that's what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. There's we always remember the Beatitudes, but the Beatitudes are a very small part of this entire sermon. Okay, this is a long sermon, and it is the standard by which he moves forward. So from this point, and of course this comes right after the temptations. He gets back into there. He's right after he has the temptations, and he goes back to the Jordan. He's baptized, and then he goes to preach. The first thing that happens is the Sermon on the Mount. Same thing in Luke's Gospel. It's the same kind of setup. You have the infancy narratives, and then you have him going out, the baptism, and then you have him first going to his home to pick up the scroll of Isaiah and to announce the year of favor. And then he goes out after he's kind of thrown out of that town, after he's thrown out of Capernaum, not out of Capernaum, after he's thrown out of Nazareth. Then he goes to Capernaum, and then in that area is where he begins his teaching, and it's the sermon on the plain there. And that ends up being chapter 6 in Luke, where he begins chapter 5, Matthew's Gospel. No, I don't think I brought that either here. So if we were to look at, just very quickly, just make a core map of the ministry of Jesus. So the Dead Sea is going to, I still get that in telepen on. Sorry. Normal pen. Okay. Next pen. Read this. Normal pen. So let's go back and try and make a poorly drawn map of Israel. So down here would be the Dead Sea. Over here would be Jerusalem. Okay? Somewhere in this area is where John was doing the baptizing. Some people think it was up here at the end of, this is the Sea of Galilee here. So some people think it was up here, some people think it was further down. But so the Sea of Galilee is here. You've got Nazareth over here. And then you've got Capernaum up here. You've got the Golan Heights up in this side. And so when Jesus would retreat into the highlands, he was really going into the Golan Heights. This over here is the road here is there's a Roman road basically that goes this way, a little bit north of Capernaum, that went to the sea. So this was a travel route. So people would come through here on a regular basis. Many different people would come through there. So it was a good place to be. The other reason, as I mentioned in one of the other classes, that what also makes this very good is that this was the end of not Herod's territory, but the other one. This was basically the end of Israelite territory, and then this was Syrian territory. And of course, the nation of Syria is over here. So whenever they're going to throw him out of somewhere, he could go to the other side, cross the border. And in those days, crossing the border meant you were safe. Now they go after you no matter where you are. That's what drones are for. But otherwise, so he could go over here, cause trouble, and then go back over on this side. They couldn't find him, and then he'd come back, or he'd come back down, and come down to Jerusalem or whatever. So this is this is Capernaum. Up here, not too far away, is the mountain of the Beatitudes, and this also would be the shore of Peter's confession, and this would be the place, again, kind of on the plain. It's a kind of a grassy area. That's where Jesus would have done the multiplication of loaves. So all of that's kind of in the same area. It's very close to each other. So he's not circling around the Sea of Galilee all the time. He's really more or less going through here, and then he'll come back down to Nazareth, or Cana's up over here too somewhere, like right around there or something, right, sister? So he'd be coming around this area for the most part. And there's Caesarea Philippi is over this way too. Okay. So let's go back to that, because I wanted to get to that salt and light thing. So as we get into the next teaching, the similes of salt and light, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its taste, with what can it be seasoned? Okay, the first thing the commentator said on this is, and I think everybody knows this, the teaching makes no sense. The metaphor doesn't have any sense. Salt doesn't lose its flavor. Okay? There are chemical things you can do to salt, such as, you dissolve it, but even if you dissolve salt in water, you'll try and drink it, it's salty water. You'll still taste something of the salt. So that combination of salt is overall it's very potent, and it doesn't really lose its flavor. The commentator is saying the English translation is just a very poor translation of what's being written. Their suggestion is, what's your new page number? There we go. Their suggestion is that not that if salt loses its flavor, but if salt is of a low quality. And of course, we get our salt at the store, so it's almost always the same quality. But you're not buying your salt at the store. You're buying, if you were back in the day, and you went from one store to another, and even now we do that with different things, right? We know that if we go to one store, the quality of their meat is better than the quality of the meat at the other store, or the quality of their baked products or whatever. So we tend to say, okay, at this store I'll buy this, this, and this. At this store I'll buy this and this. So I won't go over here for vegetables, but I'll go over here because their vegetables aren't any good, or they're not as good as the other ones. And in where there's no big conglomerate like Morton Salt to nationalize salt for everybody, but salt is being made or being mined in a sense, by individuals or small consortiums. There is low quality salt. There's rock salt. There's the salt that we throw on the sidewalks, which is very different than the salt that we throw on our food. But it's all salt. It's all sodium chloride. But there's differences. There's low grade and high grade. So, but if we say then, if we change the teaching to say, but if salt is of a low quality or of a low grade, okay, well now that, again, I'm talking about us, right? This is teaching about our relationship with God. So then, you're the salt of the earth, I am the salt of the earth. But if I'm not the kind of salt that's really good for me, if I'm a low quality salt, a low grade salt, that kind of person must be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, the image also didn't, the Israelites didn't miss the image because, I remember, reading about it when I was in school, 2,000 years later, when the Romans were tired of fighting the Carthaginians, after the Third Punic War, and they got to Carthage, they conquered Carthage, they salted the land. So they could no longer grow anything there. So that, even if they built a city, there were going to be no fields or nothing would grow. They threw so much salt in the area to over-salinate the soil, produce any crops, and people wouldn't want to live there. They were so tired of fighting this city-state, or kingdom, or empire, whatever it was at that point. So I remember that the Romans salted Carthage in order to completely destroy it. And so that image, it was certainly fresher then. It was only a couple hundred years old then, as opposed to being a couple thousand years old now. But that image was very powerful. That you completely destroy something. So bad salt, bad Christians destroy the world we live in. When you talk about the teaching about the seed must produce fruit. The seed must bear fruit 30, 60, 100-fold. But that which is oversalted, the land that is oversalted, won't produce anything. So the Christian who doesn't follow Christ destroys himself, destroys the church as well. It's a very, very powerful image. And it has nothing to do with salt losing its flavor, because salt losing, when you look at it, it's like, well, salt doesn't lose its flavor. That's almost impossible. But that was a bad translation. So if we kind of rethink the translation and say, wait a minute, if I'm the salt of the earth and I don't do what I'm supposed to do, isn't that, when he talks about being tossed out and trampled underfoot, he's talking about what the Romans did to Carthage. He's talking about being completely destroyed, that we are worthless, or we are being thrown away, we're being thrown out because we destroyed the church. So that's the power of the image, that's the strength of the image. So it's very powerful. And then he goes on, you are the light of the world. Now as he says that, he puts this up in a couple of different ways. You are the light of the world. And he almost ignores that image now. He says a city set on a mountain, a city built on a mountain cannot be hidden. That has nothing to do with the light of the world. So you're the light, you're this lamp. No, now we're going to talk about a city. Okay? But part of this is obviously for us, and I got to see this, a couple of different times on my trip. Buenos Aires is a tremendously large city, 15 million or 20 million people in there. So as you're flying into Buenos Aires, it just sprawls out before you. I was landing in the morning, so I didn't get to see the lights, but I remember landing in Mexico City, which is also a huge city, 20, 25 million people, and the lights go on forever. Or coming back to Chicago, there's lights everywhere. And of course, in Chicago, all the lights are nice straight rows, so just going to go that way. And you know where Milwaukee Avenue is, you know where the expressways are, because those lights are different color than the other lights. But it's very well organized, unlike the Mexico City lights that just, they're all over the place. But a city that's lit, and of course they didn't have cities that were lit, but a city that's on a hill, a city that stands out. And of course one of the best views of Chicago is the view from the lake, or if you're riding into Chicago from any of the expressways, you see this grand city just lit. We're not on a hill, we're on flat ground, but you just see this grand city rising up, the mountains of the skyscrapers before everything else. Long before you get to Chicago, you get to see it. And the same thing about New York and any other great cities. It's not something you hide. Obviously, cities were not that tall in Jesus' day, but the cities that were important were the cities that they wanted to protect. Jerusalem was built on a hill. And the reason they built it on a hill is so that it wasn't easily conquered. But you also can't hide it up there. Everybody can see it. So no matter how far away you are, you see the city. It's up there. It's coming. But then he comes back to the light image. So cities set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. So now he returns back to the light image, again with the understanding that you're not meant to be hidden. So this is not supposed to be, your personal little light that that helps you at night, the night light or something like that. This light has to be something, right? It has to be something significant. It has to be something powerful. The whole reason for lighting the light is not to hide it. Even if you have a night light, you don't hide it. You leave it out there, so when you get up in the middle of the night, you know where you're going. So the whole point of lighting a lamp is so that you know that it's there. You go out of the house, you leave the light on at night, so people think you're home. But also, when you get home, it's not dark. And if somebody were there, you'd be able to see them. So, the whole idea of that is that light a light so you can see. If you're the light of the world, then the light that you got by being a disciple, again, he's talking to the disciples, he's not talking to the world. He's talking specifically to disciples. If you're the light of the world, if you're a disciple, and you're the light of the world, then you are supposed to be shining.
Amen.
You are supposed to be allowing others to see Christ. And again, as he sets up the image, you put it on a lampstand where it gives light to all in the house. He doesn't say you put it next to your bed so you can get up at night. You put it on a lampstand where it gives light to all in the house. Everyone around you should be able to know you're a Christian. Should be able to see. And he emphasizes that then. Just so your light must shine before others so that they may see your good deeds. So he's not telling you to go out and preach. He's not telling you, just, go out and tell everybody, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord. So that they may see your good deeds. That's how you're going to show them that you're a Christian. By doing good in the world. And when they see you doing good, they're not supposed to praise you, because the good that you do should be done in such a way that they give praise to your Heavenly Father. Because if they're just doing good to you, or saying, oh, what a great person you are, then you miss the point. You already got your reward. That's the whole point of it. When we do some good, it's meant to give praise to God. So we try not to get the reward. At least that's the old Catholic mentality, is you try not to get the reward so that you can save it up in heaven. Yes?
You mentioned with the soul, you just stay there. It's not good for anything. Now, how about the people who fall away from faith, from faith life? Can they come back and get saved again? If they repent?
Of course they can.
Well, there's a There's a hope still open there. If
Well-
we repent,
Of course there's hope.
yeah.
Well, yeah, and you don't give up on people.
Oh,
But the point, because again, this part of the teaching is really a teaching to you, or teaching to the individual, your relationship with God.
yes.
So the point of this teaching is
Oh,
to
that's right.
is to shape your feet
Oh,
into action. It's not for us to use to judge others.
no.
It's to shape our feet into the action and say, wait a minute, am I doing what I'm supposed to do? I better get moving. Okay, I don't want to be trampled underfoot by others who because I did the wrong thing. I want to get moving. How do I get moving? Do good deeds.
And put that faith in action.
Right. Do good deeds so that people praise your Heavenly Father. That's what the teaching's about. And again, these teachings were for the disciples. It's 8:10, so I'm gonna stop here. I know we didn't get very far in this, so we'll continue on 5, 6, and 7. I'm just afraid we might not get beyond that, but I'll try and get. So we'll stay with 6 and 7 for next week, and then we'll try and get to 10 the following week, which is will be the next teaching of Jesus. But I think the Sermon on the Mount is I think it's essential to understanding what the Lord expects of us, or what Jesus is presenting of Himself to us. But because it's so many different little teachings, like I said, we can often just overlook it or wipe it over and say, okay, we got this, and that's all we needed. And there's certain ones I think that we want to highlight and bring up. So we'll focus in more on 6 and 7 next week, and then hopefully get to 10 the following week, so we can finish up there. And we won't have gotten to 13, which is the next one after that, but at least we'll have gotten the major ones for the teaching ministry of Jesus. And then we'll move into another aspect of the gospel as we get to Matthew. I'll make sure we get to those chapters ultimately, but we'll look at them from another point of view. Any questions? Yes, sister?
Today, when I was in the red line, I saw two people standing there really close. And then people were rushing the police to see if they had like a bookcase in front of them. And I saw it was on the blind. And then I looked at it and said, "I want it." So I picked them up and they were Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay, then I was on the blue line, and then I saw two people again, not pushing anything, but just standing there. So I saw it, well, I heard about this. And I was looking for it, and too, in the beginning, when you talked about the variations, where did the Jehovah's Witnesses, as I looked through this, everything had been up in our New Testament. So,
In terms of the spectrum of Christianity,
yeah, New Testament.
so where do they fall?
Right.
Where do they fall in terms of the spectrum of Christianity?
What they want.
Is that your question? Where do the Jehovah's Witnesses fall in terms of the spectrum of Christianity?
Jehovah's Witnesses,
Right.
they're from where? Same place that we do?
Okay, no, I'm going to say this, so you're going to misunderstand it. I'll try and re-explain it so you understand it, because I'm not trying to be pejorative about this. And this is really, I learned this from my Protestant brothers in the seminary when I was in the Air Force, and we were working together. Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, and Christian Scientists fall under what would be called Christian cults. Now, normally we think of a cult as the Jim Jones thing, and everybody drinks the cyanide. That's not what we mean by this. But each of these churches are cults, and because they claim Christ, they know Christ, but they do not believe in the Christ that we believe in. Okay? So, for the Jehovah's Witnesses, there is only one God. That is Jehovah, which is really a poor reading of His name, because it's Yahweh in Hebrew, not Jehovah, but because the Bible added the vowels in there, so you would not say God's name, because it's too pulling to say. That's how they read it. They read the Jehovah, and that says, oh, this is God's name. But what they didn't know is the annotations were added so people wouldn't say God's name. But So they refuse to recognize Christ as the Son of God, God from God, light from light. They say he's God's son, but only the same way that you're God's daughter. Okay? Again, our creed says he is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made. And that creed is confessed by Catholics and Orthodox and Episcopalians and Baptists and Methodists and Evangelicals. They all confess that Apostles' Creed, they all confess that Nicene Creed that is older than divisions of the churches. So the only distinction in the Nicene Creed is the Orthodox Church says that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, and we say he proceeds from the Father and the Son. But otherwise, all Christians confess that creed. Those who do not confess that creed would be, if they call themselves Christian, then they are a cult. They are not of the same belief. So, and usually it's because they have a secondary revelation. Okay? So there's another revelation besides the Bible. And in the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses, there's not a secondary revelation per se, but there is a secondary prophecy that speaks about the end of the world. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, in reading the book of Revelation, said that the world would end when there's 144,000 true believers, meaning true Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, when their numbers grew beyond 144,000, they either had changed their prophecy, or they had to say that some of our own aren't going to get into heaven. Because again, they were reading from the book of Revelation. What they failed to read in the book of Revelation is that John says, I saw, 144,000 clothed in the blood of the Lamb, clothed in white, and I saw a great multitude which no one could count. They forgot the other half of the sentence. So there's 144,000 from every tribe of Israel. Not 145,000 Christians, 140,000 from every tribe of Israel. And again, the way it's written, it could be, that means there's 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, or there's 144,000 from each of the 12 tribes, in which case it's 12 times 144,000 would be the number of saved Israelites. But then there's still this, I also saw this great crowd which no one could count, all praising the Lamb. So they forgot the next phrase. And that's the problem. When you only read what you want to read in the Bible, you don't read the whole thing. You sometimes miss things that are important. They change everything that you're going to think. So that's the issue with the Jehovah's Witnesses, because they don't consider Christ divine. They don't consider the Son of God as co-equal to the Father, because otherwise Jehovah wouldn't be the only God. The Mormons, they have a secondary revelation, which of course is, and of course the Jehovah's Witnesses, 4 times they predicted the end of the world. Unless we're all living with the beast, they've been wrong. But so they stopped predicting it, because I think it was 1937 or something like that was the last time they predicted the end of the world. The Mormons, they have the secondary revelation, which is the Book of Mormon, which retranslates the whole understanding of the creation of the world, the beginning, and what happened in the Garden of Eden. And so they set up a parallel story to basically explain why there were people in America, and then how Joseph Smith got to be called to see this vision, and he was given these golden plates that he hid from everybody and said, you can't see them, but I have them. But he never showed them to anybody, and nobody knows where they are. But anyway, there's a secondary book, the Book of Mormon. Seventh-day Adventists, they were the ones. They're the first ones to kind of challenge and come up to a poor conclusion, but a new conclusion for why we go to church on Sunday. Because Sunday's not the 7th day of the week. Sunday's not the Sabbath. Saturday's the Sabbath day. And so it was actually a Seventh-day Adventist who got his doctoral degree in Rome on that topic. And basically what happened is the Christians, we got kicked out of the synagogue, so we stopped celebrating the Sabbath. because we weren't allowed in the synagogue to celebrate with them, and many of us weren't Jews to begin with, as they started converting the Greeks and the Romans. But we also transferred our worship to the day of the resurrection, the first day of the week. And so, but what happened as we became the majority in society, we then also demanded that that first day of the week be the day off to keep holding the Sabbath, but it wasn't the Sabbath day. So then you get, in some cases, in some countries, like in Spanish-speaking countries, you get this misunderstanding, and when they write their calendar, they start their calendar on Monday and finish their calendar on Sunday because they want to show it's the seventh day of the week. But the Lord rose, but they know that it's the day of the resurrection. They know the Lord rose on Easter Sunday. But they forget that the gospel says on the first day of the week is when he rose. So that's the Seventh-day Adventists, and then around 1865 or so, basically as they were setting up their religion and looking at these various things, they also made a prophecy that Christ was going to, in the letter to the Hebrews, they talk about Christ being in the temple of God, the sanctuary of God, and that he was going to move into the Holy of Holies, and that would be the end of the world. When the Lord moved from before the altar of God to the altar of God, symbolically in heaven. Well, and they counted 1,000 years from his death, because that's what they talk about in Hebrews, is 1,000 years. And so they said the Lord's going to stand before the altar of God in heaven for 1,000 years. Well, so they calculated that somehow as being like 1865. I don't know how they figured 1,000 years from his death was 1865, but that's what they calculated. And then they had a problem because 1865 came and went and the world didn't end. It may have seemed like it at some times with the Civil War. This is an American church, obviously, but it didn't end. And so then Ellen White reinterpreted the original prophecies so that way they would continue the church, and that he didn't move. He didn't move to the altar, but he moved into the Holy of Holies after the 1,000 years, and therefore he's now before God, interceding for us. So, but again, they don't see Christ as equal to God. It's almost the Arian heresy that he's the highest of creatures, but he's not God. It's the Islam question. So Muhammad, because there's only one God, Muhammad is the prophet, and he's the great prophet. Nobody can make fun of him, but they won't call him God, because that would destroy that one God theory. Which is, again, why Christians, we're the ones who follow God coming to us. Buddha, Muhammad, nobody else ever claimed to be the Son of God. Finally, you had, what was the last one we had? Oh, Church of Christ Scientists, so Christian scientists. And of course, I'm not even including Scientology because they're not even Christians. That's L. Ron Hubbard's group. But Church of Christ Scientists, again, in reinterpreting the Bible, it is not Christ who, saves you, but rather your right relationship with God. And so Christ is pushed to the side, and then, of course, you have these beliefs about the ones that everybody knows about is not using medicine but using prayer, because they're pulling this from the letter of St. James. And so they want to only use prayer, and of course that's how Jesus cured people. And so they said, you don't need medicine, you don't need any of these things, you only use prayer. One of the great Seventh-day Adventists was actually Kellogg. So Kellogg cereal. That's Battle Creek, Michigan is a Seventh-day Adventist stronghold. Loma Linda, California is another town that's very heavily. That's why I know all this, because I was doing my CPE work in Loma Linda, California at the Veterans Hospital, but I had to stay at the university, which is the Seventh-day Adventist University. And the first week there were only 2 Catholics in this program, but they made sure we were not living with we were not living together, but rather each of us had 3 Seventh-day Adventist roommates. So the first thing that happened is my roommates were all saying, well, you have to come to church on Friday night. And no, I don't. I'm a Catholic. Oh no, you have to come to church. Well, you know what? I'm not going to be there. You can go to church. I'm not going to be there. So then the one day that I was having dinner in the apartment room and I had wine, the head of the housing happens to come by. You know, I offered my roommate if he wanted some dinner, or was having a spaghetti dinner and had some wine at the table. I'm like, no, I don't want any. Like half an hour later, the head of the housing, no, you're not allowed to have wine in dorms. You know that. But anyway. So those four are Christian cults. That's why they're cults, is because they do not confess Christ as the Son of God, equal to God. Any other questions?
The Amish, what are the Amish cults?
No, they're a Christian church. Yeah. Again, the mark of the Christian church is whether or not they confess the creed. Okay. So they obviously they don't pray the same way we pray, and they believe that everything should be stuck. That somehow the right time to live in is 1765 or whatever that is. But they don't want anything beyond that. But for their own personal lives. However, in business, like in all things, in business they will move forward. So my parents had wonderful cabinets made by these Amish people, and they went to their barn where they make the cabinets. There were all kinds of machines and lathes and electrical stuff and all that. In the barn they had electricity for their work, but in the homes they didn't have any electricity or anything because, again, that's how they chose to live. Yeah, but they are Christians.
That was interesting.
Oh, in the letter of John, it says, and we know the Son, reckon their Son, even the Son of their Father as well.
Right.
If they don't have neither, how can they be saved?
Well, I'm not going to go that far, but
Well,
I'm just letting you know the
That's very
standard.
important.
Here's the standard of what makes a Christian, and the creed is what makes a Christian. So, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Baptists, Bible thumpers, Catholics, Orthodox, we all confess that same creed. Amish, Quakers, we all confess that same creed. Those other four do not confess that creed. But they do have faith in Christ, but not to the same creed. And they usually have a secondary revelation, which of course our understanding as Christians is that you only need the Bible to reveal what God wants us to know. Okay, it's almost 8:30.